Good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to today's webinar, TMS and Real-Time Visibility equals Maximum Supply Chain Resilience, organized by Alpega TMS in collaboration with our great partner, Shippeo. My name is Marta Molith, and I'm the segment manager for Alpega TMS, and I will be assistant to today's speakers. I'm delighted to have joining me Salah, the Director of TMS Alliances at Alpega, and Thomas from Shippeo as Director Central Europe. Before we kick off the session, I would like to share a couple of housekeeping rules. By default, you have joined the webinar on mute, but we invite you, of course, to pose questions throughout the whole session in the questions tab that you can see on your screen. We will be having a dedicated Q&A session at the end, but we will also be answering questions as we go if they really fit with the conversation that we will be having. Please also be aware that the session will be recorded and that the link will be shared with all the registrants afterwards. Last but not least, we also want to hear from the audience, so we will be launching some surveys during the session that you can answer on the poll tab also on your screen. Also, before we start, I just wanted to quickly introduce Alpega TMS and Shippeo, the participants of today's webinar. On the Alpega side, so Alpega, we cover the end-to-end transportation process with our TMS. So from sourcing and procurement to cost settlement and reporting, ensuring that our customers can position themselves for success using the solutions we provide. By bringing manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers closer together with their suppliers and their carriers, we create a holistic view of the supply chain. Shippeo is one of the global leaders and European specialists in real-time transportation visibility and helps major shippers and logistics service providers leverage their transportation, delivering exceptional customer service and to achieve operational excellence. Their multimodal visibility network integrates with more than 800 TMS, softwares, telematics, and ELD systems. But that's enough about us. What we'll be talking about today. So first of all, we will be covering the current situation, what's at stake on the supply chain environment these days, what are the different key challenges and opportunities that we see, and then we will also be discussing resilience strategies that are key today. And then we will be discussing as well how a TMS and real-time visibility can support you in those in achieving better resilience for your supply chain. And without further ado, Salah, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marta, indeed. And thank you, Thomas, for joining in for this afternoon. And of course, always glad to engage with our audience today. And our topic for today is indeed a series of disruptions that we've been witnessing recently. And clearly, I mean, if you are a supply chain manager today, you have been through a giant lab experiment, really. There's no other word for that. And clearly, a lot of us have been caught a little bit off guard, and nobody would have imagined, I would say, the recent course of action just by reflecting 2 or 3 years ago. Obviously, what you are seeing on the screen here is just a sample of the different forces that have been really battering supply chains and global supply chains with no distinction of region, no distinction of industry. So there are some commonalities, of course, within those different events, is that the scale seems to keep on increasing. So the scale of the disruption, the frequency of the disruption, but in the same time, our ability to detect beforehand does not seem to improve any better. So that's also an important aspect. But what is also noteworthy for me as an introduction for today's discussion about resilience with Thomas is the fact that there are few winners that have been emerging, few supply chain that have been emerging as profiting or benefiting, I would say, from this overall chaos. And those supply chains in particular have been deploying and displaying a true resilient character. So that's a little bit the focus for us today. just for the sake of the introduction, I think I wanted to reuse this little piece of British folklore, which is a known story, of course, of that horseshoe nail that went missing and that kind of snowballed, into a large effect that turned into a doom of the full kingdom, I would say. And I find that it is a good illustration as well of modern times fragility that we are also incorporating into our own supply chains. To illustrate that, two quick samples to also insist on the fact that this is not a new phenomenon, it's just a phenomenon that keeps on increasing in scale. So two little stories. The first one about an automotive manufacturer that saw its own production coming to a halt simply because a deep tier supplier experienced a major disturbance, actually not far away from where Thomas is situated today. And that incident with this supplier caused more than 2,000 suppliers, actually, of General Motors to almost completely shut down production. What is interesting and noteworthy that this incident went completely off the radar of the OEM, and GM obviously was not the singular case to be caught off guard. So what is the supplier providing is not seen, for example, on the bills of materials. The supplier does not appear on the database or the ERP of the OEM, and that's a little bit the illustration of certain items that simply can go completely under the radar. So it's a little bit like that king that did not know about the horseshoe nail. The other example that I wanted to illustrate is also a $1 billion example, actually, and it's about Intel, of course, the processor manufacturer, that also lost $1 billion, as I mentioned, in sales, not much due to its own supply chain, but simply because demand was completely wiped out, simply because the OEMs or the computer builders were not able to source hard drives any longer. So what does this tell us? I mean, and what is the key message here is that how expensive should a lesson be in order for us as supply chain community to understand the importance and the essence of this resilient character? Probably $1 billion, as in the case of Intel, is not enough. And a little bit provocatively, we wanted to test $100 billion, if it would be enough for us to understand actually what is at stake. So we picked this more recent example. Actually, this is, I would say, the headlines and the covers from Bloomberg that you are seeing on the left side of your screen, that is illustrating very clearly that the automotive industry globally has been losing no less than 110 billion in sales just for the year 2021. And when you look a little bit at this topic of chip shortage, obviously, in which they've been in competition with some other industries, you would see still these notion of clusters, these notion of concentration. And we are, of course, in love with clusters. I think they allow a lot of benefits in terms of ecosystem and so on, but they are also a concentration of risk. And this is also an important notion when you see that 80% of the chip output is coming just from South Korea and Taiwan, and you take into account, of course, the growing ambition of our Chinese partners, I would say, into that industry, you can somewhat realize as well how important and how strategic this importance of having dual sources, multiple sources, and also bringing in nearshoring a little bit when it comes to the high tech. Further expanding as well into this automotive topic, because I think it is an illustration. Again, it's not an industry that we want to single out, but it's really highly regarded as really the cornerstone, and it has been giving and defining actually the best practices for the whole supply chain community. So if you think and reflect of some of the transformations that this industry is ongoing with the electric vehicle as well, you see these two factors of growing dependency on very simple and very singular items that are materials, in this case rare earth materials, and you see as well the predominance of the Chinese partner in terms of processing capacity and even extraction capacity. So should we expect this pressure to ease, to decrease? Absolutely not, because obviously we need more electric vehicles on the road in order to meet, of course, the sustainable development scenario objectives that everybody is obviously talking about. Now, narrowing down, and without further expanding on that topic, but narrowing down particularly on transportation and on freight transportation, I wanted to invite our audience today to reflect a little bit on the last 20 years and see a little bit how we have been doing in terms of CO2 emission. And clearly there is something that really emerged and really it pops really into the eyes, is the fact that we've been capable of adding up no less than 40% of greenhouse emission and CO2 emissions in particular. So over the last 2 decades, we added up 40% of emissions. And clearly, if we are on a trajectory to meet the sustainable development scenario objectives, we have, first of all, to curb that level of emissions before even decreasing it in a rather aggressive manner, and we do not have a lot of time to do that. So minus 70% is already for 2030. So it's also another call to reflect maybe to our audience today, as they are reflecting, on their demand shaping, for example, with omni-channel, with direct to customer, and so on and so forth, but also when thinking of their transportation networks, or simply when they are organizing their next transportation tender. What are the tools and assets and the processes that they prepare, that they put in place in order to meet their SDS objectives and take their own share, of course, of responsibility? And it is quite important because there is obviously an opportunity cost. We cannot simply pass the tab to a supplier or make a small game with the Incoterms and say, no, that's a responsibility of somebody else, of some other polluters, because we need to understand that this response should be global. Of course, it is uneven and asymmetric. It's not going to hit all the industrial sectors, all the economic sectors with the same strength, but we need to be conscious as well, just to take the example of the carbon tax, for example, that it's going to wipe out between 40 and 80% of the earnings per share of the material sector, of the energy sector, for example, of the utilities sector. So by doing that, these sectors, of course, will get fragilized. They will not have the ability to invest in R&D in order to curb the very CO2 that they are generating in first place. But Marta, let me pause here for a while and probably turn it over to the real reason why we have so many intervenants today, and to hear more from Thomas, hopefully.
Yes, thank you, Salah. I think indeed you touch upon a lot of topics and a lot of challenges that supply chains are facing today. But we would like now to ask the audience, before we move forward, to share with us what is their greatest resilience challenge today. So if you now go on the polls section, you can answer the question so we can also learn a bit what is happening on your supply chains today. So let's give it a minute for everybody to participate. All right, all the responses are coming in. That's great. Thank you for sharing with us. All right. Thomas, any thoughts on the results that you can see on the poll?
Yeah, many thanks, Marta. Many thanks, Salah, for the introduction. It's quite interesting, and I'd like to say it's without surprise that actually the supply shortages come with 46%, so nearly 50% on top, which is apparently the number one topic that we're seeing in the last couple of months. And then, of course, we still see COVID, which still affects supply chains, and which is probably also a driver, even if it's a recent one, to add resilience. So I think, Salah, you described a couple of very interesting thoughts on different scenarios where the traditional risk approach failed. So let's now dig a bit deeper and see why the traditional methods fail in today's economic surroundings. If you look at supply chain analysis, very often you will find 4 areas that they are built on: data, delay, investments, and then assumptions. Now, if I ask the audience today, do you trust your data that you have at hand in your company? Probably most of you will say more or less, but probably not 100%. So we see that data is not up to date. It's sometimes not consistent, and sometimes we just don't have it at hand when we need it. If we look at delays on risk assessments, very often we conduct risk assessments on an ad hoc basis because there's a problem, but we don't do this in a very regular, planned way. So we have this delay between doing something and then trying to understand what is actually going wrong. Same goes for investments. If you are working for bigger companies, investment take budget cycles. We need to approve budgets. We need to go and make the investment. So that's where we see actually also a time gap between something that is disrupting the supply chain today and then actually doing something against it. And then on the last part, assumptions. We see traditionally in big corporations that we have a lot of assumptions, a lot of assessments that are being done are based on such a broad number of assumptions that we don't concentrate on the ones that are really important. And if you take these four main factors now and apply them in a traditional, 2-to-2 matrix, what most of the companies do, you will find this quite impractical. Now, what we believe is that there's a fifth dimension, as I would call it, that is actually missing in this analysis, and this is resilience. And as we discussed, and as the title says of this webinar, in the last, especially 18, 24 months, we have heard a lot about resilience. Everybody's speaking about resilience, but what does it actually mean in the context of supply chain? So if we go a bit more into the scientific part of it and see what defines resilience. So we say in supply chain, it's the ability to return to its original state after disruption. Now, that's quite interesting to see. So when we look in a modern view on a supply chain and a supply chain analysis, we want to balance vulnerabilities and capabilities, and on building capabilities into a supply chain to deal with disruptions, regardless of the nature or the origin. So the definition is quite wide indeed. So let's try to make it a bit more concrete and down to earth when we talk about it. What are examples of capabilities in a supply chain? What we see a lot is flexibility. If you have flexibility in suppliers, in manufacturing, in distribution or in transportation, that is actually a capability that you have in a supply chain. Another capability is redundancy, making sure that if something is going wrong, another element can take over. But we also talk a lot about visibility nowadays. So visibility becomes definitely one of your capabilities into your supply chain. And then, of course, which we should not forget, and that's also driven by the 50% is capacity. So, of course, there are many more in terms of capabilities, but I think these capabilities empower companies to be ready for disruption and to make sure that we implement resilient strategies. I just wanted to give you a quick example. Let's take the Performance Food Group in the US. They did exactly that. Although they didn't know upfront how Irma, the hurricane, would impact the operations, they took several measures to strengthen their supply chain. For instance, additional products were stocked in 10 distribution centers in the path of Irma to make sure that increasing demand after the hurricane passed could be fulfilled. That's about capacity. Additional generators were provided to preserve perishable products in case of power outage, right? So we want to add redundancy into our supply chain. And then they had agreements with local companies, which were made to ensure additional personnel could be hired to support the distribution, as some of the employees might be or were expected to leave their homes before the storm. And then after the hurricane passed, a transport routing system incorporating real-time information on the road conditions improved the distribution. So that's a very good example and a very practical example on how we define resilience and how we can improve resilience in supply chains. Now, let me discuss two ways of looking at it and how I actually implement real strategies that work. There is, of course, a very short or midterm view on strategies, and probably let's start with this one. Salah, you mentioned it already. We have the dual sourcing. We want to avoid this diamond character of supply chain network that we saw earlier, especially in commodities, but also in LSPs, meaning in the capacity to distribute and to bring the products where you actually need it. Then there is, on the short term, optimize, increase inventory. We were talking about additional DCs where you stock products. There is a cost to it, but as So I mentioned the 110 billion question. We need to weigh what is actually the cost and what is the gain that we can take out of it. And then, of course, anything that goes into optimization, increasing production and logistics capacity. We want to add buffer, something especially in the automotive industry we didn't want to do for a couple of years or for a long time. Now we're seeing it. We want to have this buffer because the production shortage might be of a bigger consequence than we thought in the beginning. And something that we're going to talk about a bit more in a second is also transparency. We want to know what's going on in my supply chain. And I don't want to know this 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later, a year later. I want to see it in real time. I want to identify my bottlenecks, and I want to know where do I have a problem today, and then predictively, proactively act into my supply chain. So that's what we call the short to midterm strategies to become more resilient in my supply chain. But of course, there are also some long-term strategies which go, we talked about it earlier, investments, data, which aim at improving our capacity in the longer run. The first one that we see a lot in the couple of, probably in the last 2 to 3 years, is the concept of control towers. So we want to enable our customers to create this end-to-end visibility, multimodal throughout the whole network, making sure that we identify any weak spots in my supply chain and then act accordingly. So control towers become more and more important in the modern way of looking at supply chain analysis, and then also into improving and bringing resilience into it. Of course, we're also talking about digital twins, so making sure that we can model what is actually going on in real time, so that we can apply what if or other scenarios to make sure that we can have a prediction of what's going on. And then, of course, going a bit further, even in the long-term strategies, it's about sourcing, it's about manufacturing, bringing agility into these areas. So that's something what we see as being long-term, being midterm. Let me go a bit deeper into one specific topic, which is the control tower. Why control tower, and what is actually the value that is coming out of the control tower for all of us working in supply chain? Let me pick 3 very concrete examples. Implementing a control tower based on real-time visibility brings value. Let's take 3 main operations: customer service, operations in itself, and then inventory. And why does it actually work this way? Because if you take the customer service, if you give the information that the customer service is needing, they can actually see that you can manage shipments in time. You have electronic integration. You know where the data is sitting. You can give the information not only to your internal customers, but also to your external customers. So all of a sudden, it's not the customer calling you and asking for something because they're expecting a shipment, a load, or whatever it is. It's actually you identifying this proactively, and you are therefore inversing the way you work with the customer. So it's very interesting, especially for companies who work with NPS scoring systems. They will see that through an implementation of a control tower and through the use of proactive data, they will improve their NPS with their customers, which is becoming more and more important, of course, in the modern world. Second example that I wanted to discuss is operation and operation costs. So how does the control tower help? We will see through the control tower that we are going to consolidate multiple shipments to the same origin destination. We will understand in this network, in this ecosystem, that some flows are parallel. And if we want to work on the cost side, we can combine them and then bring them together. So that's a typical part how we bring down costs in the supply chain. And then, of course, sharing service infrastructure. If we detect and if we learn that we have operators that use the same facilities, we can actually work on these costs and make sure that these costs are coming down as well. And then, of course, when we're talking about operations, a day-to-day work of a planner, of a transport planner, is making sure that the accurate shipment routing via the optimal cost channel is being executed on the fly. And that's really how we see with our customers and how they bring the operation costs down. Last example around inventory, very interesting, because you will see, and we also have a customer example with us, which I'm going to explain in 5 minutes. We want to create, through the real-time control tower, a direct link to your inventory. We want to show you what is your inventory today? That's probably something you know, but what is your inventory in 4 hours, in 6 hours, in 12 hours, probably in 2 days, by combining information from incoming shipments and making sure that you always know what's going on. And then, of course, if we go further on in the inventory, we want to measure supply chain performance. We want to know where we stand, what are peaks, how can we work on peaks. We want to reduce transit time. We want to give visibility on the in-transit inventory. And of course, by doing this, we want to reduce risk. So that's really the three areas that we wanted to discuss today. How a control tower, which for us is a long-term strategy, this implies a major shift in a company, but how this actually helps to drive and to bring resilience into your supply chain. Now, I'm pretty sure that some of the audience will now ask me, but how do you do this? How can you actually enable us? And how can you tap into this data world? It's actually something that we have been doing over the last 5 to 7 years. We have built thousands of integrations into the transport world, into systems, inventory systems, into LSPs, into trucking companies through telematics, into container shipping terminal systems. All this data which is out there, we build the connectors, we import this data, and again, it's live data. We're talking about real-time data. And this allows us today to feed different control towers through the data that we see that is already out there that you just need to tap in. And we take this data and feed this into your control tower. And then, of course, there's also a change. We're talking a lot about digitalization, about the transformation that we're seeing. It's not only on the shipper side. We see now carriers, LSP, who have become much more major on the IT level. They can easily provide data through APIs, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, it's not yet done on everybody in the industry, but we see that the wave is actually going in the right direction, and that is actually data that we can already leverage today and that we can use today. I said earlier, I'm gonna also talk about a very specific customer example. A customer for all our German participants, easy to pronounce, Fressnapf. For the international ones, it's Maxiso. It's the biggest pet food retailer in Europe with more than 1,500 stores. Quite a lot of truck deliveries and quite a lot of incoming containers. Because if you look at the product portfolio, you will see, of course, the typical food part, but you also have the non-food part, which is typically sourced overseas, and therefore you have quite an important impact on the transportation part. Why is it so important to understand for them or to have a real-time view, a visible supply chain network? It's very easy. Imagine you are an e-commerce customer. During the last 18 months, you couldn't go out, you were in lockdown, but you have pets at home, so you need to order food. What do? You order food online. So the e-commerce store will actually tell you, yeah, this product is still in stock, so I can deliver you in the next 24 or 48 hours. That's great. But probably you will also experience a situation as a supply chain planner that the products are out of stock. But by using this control tower concept and by using the real-time data, you will also see today, right now, I'm out of stock for this specific product, but I've got a shipment which is with an ETA of the next plus 2 hours. So I know that the shipment will be incoming in the next 2 hours. So I don't need to tell my customer who's online that the product is out of stock because I'm promising plus 24 or plus 48 hours delivery. So I can still do the intake and ship the next day and still keep my promise to the customer. So these are really just some examples on how in real life control towers are used, and how I talked about NPS, which can also apply on a B2C system, which helps to drive customer satisfaction, which helps to bring costs down in the supply chain area. And that's really what Alpega and Shippeo is doing in this combined data world by delivering this control tower to you. And I think, Salah, I leave it here for the first part as an introduction. If there are any questions, please feel free, and you can shoot them through the question tab on the right-hand side. Over to you, Salah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. It was extremely insightful indeed. And to you, Marta, maybe if you want to introduce the second poll question for today.
Yes, thank you, Salam. Thank you, Thomas. It was indeed a very interesting discussion on. And before we move on to the next part of the webinar, we also wanted to hear from the audience once more from the whole discussion, everything that we have been talking about, what are the things that will require an immediate action for you to improve your resilience? So I'm just launching a second poll to also gather your thoughts and your insights here. All right, all the answers are coming in. Let's give it a second.
Yeah,
All right.
we need to add some drum beat, I think. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you all for sharing your insights. Maybe Salah, a comment on the survey.
Actually, I need to submit a vote myself, and yeah, I mean, yeah, I was a little bit in the same mood than everybody. Yeah, so indeed, reviewing operations. Huh? Our audience today is identifying actually some very simple and easy steps as the items that need to be prioritized most. So it is also a call to action. This is the moment we should really stop talking about resilience and start doing something about it. Huh? So this is a little bit in a nutshell. Of course, you need to review business models too. You need to move from a product company to a service company to a platform company as well. For every business today is a digital business, and all the items that Thomas indeed put forward around the net promoter score, about delighting the customer, about making sure that you are looking at the lifetime value and thinking of your product way beyond actually the way it gets out of your factory. These are important steps indeed. So in reviewing those operations, I think this is really the moment for me to summarize a little bit that what we discussed, and also a teaser for our large audience today to put in as much questions as possible, so that we can have enough time as well to go through them. What Thomas explained around the control tower kind of fits in quite well with a recent publication actually coming from MIT, yeah? From Jim Rice, director at MIT, who tried to summarize the core capabilities actually that are expected in terms of resilience. So the core capabilities around distribution, around procurement, transportation, communication, and the ability to maintain as well the financial flows after, of course, the disaster happens and after that disaster recovery phase. So, and that kind of fits in perfectly in the different functions that the control tower needs to deliver, as very well illustrated by Thomas. But let's be clear on one thing, I think, and this is my own experience from this webinar. Of course, we discussed a lot about supply chain. It's also the nature of our audience that drives that type of conversation. But people are also regarding companies like Shippeo, like Alpega, as digital platforms as well, as digital companies as well. I just want to paraphrase very quickly, actually, Yves Morieux from BCG, and he simply explains that in today's world, I would say every business is a digital business, and every supply chain manager is also a digital manager. And he's even a little bit further. I mean, he's a digital transformer as well. So one of the things maybe that we can bring in to the table as digital platforms as well is our unique look into data. And we are not seeing it really as a necessary evil or as a hassle that helps you implement the command and control that you are expecting, but we are looking into data as well as very good ways to unlock some value streams, right? So there are a few templates, of course, to contemplate. I'm not going through them at all, absolutely not the purpose. But if you think of insight, for example, how am I behaving versus, for example, my suppliers, my competitors, my customers, what is their perception? That's also some of the items that you can get, obviously, through our data lakes as well, and by having a better and more accurate look into that data. There is this notion as well of context by providing, for example, a few frames. We talked extensively about CO2. How are we doing with regards to such a responsibility, for example? There is the topic, as Thomas mentioned it very well, you want to take care to delight your customer. There are some specific data points that he might be interested in. How do you make sure that you are shaping the message exactly and tailoring it to the proper audience so that people can get updated all the time and every time? I think these are some of the aspects I would say, and I would love to discuss more for those interested around these. But these are, I think, becoming as well some of the priorities of a supply chain manager. He cannot look simply at the stock level and making sure that, of course, his forecast errors are under control, his or her forecast errors are under control, but it is also much more than that, and expanding more into the digital economy that we are all experiencing. Right, I think, Marta, you are just on mute if you want to
Yes,
pick it
sorry.
up.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Salah and Thomas, for all the insights that you have been sharing. I think now we are opening the floor to the audience for some Q&A. And I already had some questions coming in. What is the percentage of traffic using APIs?
Yeah, let me take this one, Marta. Very interesting question, since the world is changing, as we call it. We are seeing today in our real-time visibility solution more than 55% of API connections, and this is growing. And therefore, I'm a bit careful with the number, because that's changing actually every month, and we see a strategic shift which is going into the API world. So we believe that probably within the next 18 to 24 months, we'll hit somewhere 80 to 85%, but definitely API is growing rapidly and is the preferred connection of choice.
Great, thank you, Thomas. Somebody in the audience is asking if can we go into further detail on how a TMS and real-time visibility aids in just-in-time and lean manufacturing flows.
Sana, you want to go first, and then I can probably complete?
My apologies, I got trapped as well with the mute button. So yeah, basically, yeah, when it comes indeed to the topic of visibility in general, it's also, there is an operational angle, I think, to that that is important to mention, and certainly Thomas will expand a bit more in that direction. It is quite essential indeed to have that level of visibility. Not much, I would say, from control perspective, but it is also to allow actually people who are depending on you. You need to realize that as a supply chain manager, you are also representing a counterparty risk. So if you are not offering the right level of visibility, you are not simply a danger for your own colleagues, but also for your suppliers and your customers. So we are kind of, raising the bar up a little bit, and this is what technology is allowing us to do. The API economy, the cost of data points that is dramatically decreasing, and these items, of course, are helping us really greatly delivering that type of use case that goes beyond the simple comfort of seeing finally where my shipment is and where my part is, but really making sure that I am also having the right points of information being relayed to both my suppliers, but also obviously my customers.
Yeah, and probably just Salah, thanks. I think that's the perfect answer. I think what we're seeing is there's a growing maturity in the space, in the supply chain space, meaning that after the last 24 months, and again, I'm going back to the first poll where the audience answered, the supply issues that we face today leads typically to an increase of maturity, meaning that companies who are able to provide a certain level of service will reduce risk and will increase resilience into the supply chains of your customer. And therefore, we see that it's not only one vertical or one sector in the industry that is moving. We see an increasing maturity in this area of supply chain, and that's why we see also we are just the enabler. The API or the technology is the enabler. Our job is really to make this data available for your analysis, as we stated in the very beginning. And then it's a growing impact throughout the different layers in the network, but definitely the maturity in itself in the supply chain area is increasing rapidly. And I guess everybody of us will need to make sure that we are part of this movement. Yeah.
Yeah, and so does indeed, absolutely in your sense, Thomas. And I think it's indeed a great question that begs for an additional comment, and it links as well to the conversation around the ROI per se. So we saw that that conversation is getting elevated more and more. So if we used to think of savings, of course, in terms of process, in terms of transportation spend, there were some cost avoidance aspects as well. But yeah, that risk log, I would say, has its own share of importance as well, and it's also taking more and more, I would say, the front stage, simply because businesses today, as you mentioned so well, Thomas, indeed earlier with your example, of increasing a little bit the level of inventory beyond the authorized lines of controlling working capital and so on. But that begs indeed the comment around that. We are requesting the businesses, the suppliers, the customers to stay really into their swim lanes and keep on doing what they are expected to do. Of course, there will be price bumps. Of course, there will be inflation. Of course, you will have transportation cost increases and so on. But your primary duty is to make sure that your product is also available on the shelf. Because let's make no mistake, I mean, if the product is not delivered to the final customer, no matter how sophisticated or lean you are delivering zero value from supply chain perspective. So that's a little bit as well to expand in your sense around the ROI point.
Great, thank you. So next question. Any GPS location tracking included in the control tower to show real-time track status?
Yes, I take this question, very good question, and the simple answer is yes, and that's exactly what Shippeo and Alpega is providing. It is the link between real-time visibility, and it's about tracking status of a truck. And I think the question goes a bit further, because it's not only on truck level, it's on unit level. So you might have only FTLs and the full truck, so you can track the whole truck. But of course, you might have other modes where you probably have L2L shipments. And then, of course, we go down to the unit level and scan and track the unit level and provide this real-time information on the unit level back into the control tower. Definitely, yeah.
Great, thank you. So there is another question coming in. Can you give an example of how a company avoided disruptions due to COVID-19 because they already had these solutions you have been talking about in place?
Yeah, I can, and I know that Salah will add other examples, but that's actually a good one. We had actually a couple of customers who were sourcing mainly in Far East and who had pre-booked passages on vessels for containers from Asia coming into European ports. With the closure of ports in China due to COVID-19 restrictions, we realized in real time that these containers have not yet been arrived at the port in China. Therefore, we didn't have specific events like gates in, customs, etc. So all the events that we get out of the container terminals, and we were able in real time to reroute the containers back into a rail station. And finally, these containers were put on a rail train that were actually unloaded not far where I'm sitting here in Düsseldorf at the station in Duisburg, which is one of the biggest rail terminals here in Europe. So that's one very classical, straightforward example. You switch between modes depending on the real-time visibility that we will provide on the road that was on the route that was initially booked. So that allows supply chain planners to react instantly, or even to proactively replan certain ways and certain lanes when you see that there's a problem. And that's something that we have seen quite often. Even that led, and I think all the rail specialists in this audience will have more examples around this. We had a 20% increase in rail China to Duisburg over the last 6 months. So I think that's one typical example, and probably Salah, you might also want to add another one.
No, I think you illustrated it perfectly, Thomas, indeed. What I can add from my perspective, I would say, from our own experience with the TMS, is that those rerouting decisions are happening every day. Actually, according to some data crunching that we did on our very own database here at Alpega, Thomas, in order to execute a load tender or a transportation order, if you wish, you need 1.4 load tenders. I mean, so that's the overhead. Of course, not all of it is due to transportation per se, because you might have some adjustment in your production schedule, you might have some QA issues and so on, and you need to refuse the batch. But we have on a daily basis a lot of those updates and changes actually in the transportation routes that are taking. And what API is allowing and what the collaboration with Shippeo is also helping us implement is the ease of circulation of that information. We saw some customers, for example, rerouting simply certain flows and shipping from a different location just because the carrier was able to inform them, thanks to the live tracking sensors, that there were some problems on the road, that there was really a huge issue with the bridge that they cannot go through any longer. So thanks to that, they were able to do the necessary adjustment, and so that they made their operation go smoothly and limit really the impact of an otherwise, a classical way of exchanging where you would face an issue and you would need to declare it and so on. So that level of proactivity is also allowed today by real-time visibility. What is the dollar value for that? It's a little bit pretentious to say this is exactly the dollar value or the face value. It depends pretty much on a lot of things, on the cargo value, the value of these goods to your own customer. Of course, the repercussions of the stockouts, not only on your customers, but also your customers' customers. Let's remember the name. So all of that, I would say, boils down to that essential piece, which is saying that you're going to build the transportation plan as perfect as possible. You're going to optimize versus a cost function or a CO2 footprint function or whatever function. But what would make your plan still relevant is that real-time information sensing that is feeding it back and making sure that what you are executing is still the perfect plan. And whatever adjustments are still getting you as close as possible to the optimum. So it's really like the yin and the yang, and this is what a control tower is about. It's not simply designing a perfect plan, but making sure that it is also adjusted, I would say, along the way.
Thank you very much. There are a lot of questions coming in. So some people are asking a bit more to learn about the partnership between Alpega TMS and Shippeo. What are the benefits that if you're a Shippeo customer, how can you benefit from Alpega TMS and vice versa? So maybe you can elaborate a bit on that because several people are asking.
Yeah, sure. Very fair question.
Thank you so much. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Salah. Thanks. I think there are some immediate benefits actually if you are either already an Alpega or a customer of Shippeo, which is the way we connect today the two platforms is done in a very robust and unified way, meaning that it's not something that we need to build and rebuild for any new customers, but we can just use existing APIs and existing data exchange to more put an additional data layer into a world of an existing customer. So I think the main benefit or the easiest benefit is there is already a connection done. We don't need to talk about long and costful IT projects. That's the first one. I think the second one is I put it from the perspective if you're already a Shippeo customer, so you know already everything around real-time visibility, about predictive ETA and how we use this. So that's something that you might already experience. And then going into the planning part and doing all the additional functionality that is coming out of the TMS, you basically combine it. So you can either build on the foundation of real-time visibility, add on top the TMS, and it gives you the whole functionality set that Alpega is providing. Or if you start the other way around, you're already an Alpega customer, but you want to include real-time visibility, real-time data into your analysis, into your dashboarding, into the KPIs and into your control tower, then you just switch on Shippeo and we can provide, again, through this data tunnels that already exist, the data. So I think the benefit is really you can either start with Shippeo or you can start with Alpega, but the combination of both of them is quite easy to implement.
It's a fantastic summary indeed of the different customer journeys that can happen, of course. You can start with the Shippeo brick or with the Alpega brick. You're going to get access to enhanced portfolio, of course, of functionalities. We mentioned the importance of procurement for your CO2 objectives. We mentioned, of course, the importance of the freight settlement and how paramount it is. I mean, if you look at the amount of work that is put just for the additional cost calculation, for example, and the settlement part of the process, it's also an essential piece that you can get access to as a Shippeo customer quite easily. I am also quite actually really am proud of the amount of investment actually that we put both Alpega and Shippeo into this partnership as well. We worked very hard on that experience actually, on those integration chains, on making sure that the data is available as accurately as possible. We mentioned indeed, Thomas, some bricks, but for example, if you think of the inventory on site, because we spent a lot of energy and time today talking about the inventory in transit, but if you are looking within the individual warehouse, you have a series of inbound shipments, for example, coming in, you would love to see if you are allocating your resources or blocking your staging area with the right component. So that type of process, for example, you might be familiar already with the slot booking from Alpega, but you would love indeed to enhance that slot booking with a real-time flavor of the senses that would be collected in this case by our brothers and partners at Shippeo. So that's a little bit the type of bridge that we are seeing more and more, and this is where I think the market is going as well. So we can think, of course, of everyone doing his piece, I would say, into his own silo, the way a normal company would be organized, but you are also multiplying the value just by sharing those data points. So more sharing, more data, more use case, this is exactly where the world is heading to.
Thank you very much, Thomas and Salah. One more question from the audience.
Yeah.
Jay Rice also identified the 7 core capabilities of supply chain which can be impacted by disruption, and where it is more important to do work on these issues rather than on risk assessment. Somebody from the audience is asking if we agree to this, and if so, how do Shippeo and Alpega TMS help in this matter? I think somehow we covered this, but
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm very glad to revisit that. Indeed, I mentioned Dr. Rice, indeed, from MIT, and it's quite a recent paper, actually. It was from three weeks ago, and I found it quite pertinent because it's so practical. Look, you don't think of resilience as a strategy, simply as a risk assessment kabuki dance or any kind of corporate formalism, but you are really looking at a checklist of the type of capabilities you need to have. Indeed, in the model, there are 7 capabilities. There is a piece on HR, obviously, which is very important, for which I did not put it forward, simply because our angle is the procure to pay and the order to cash. And very honestly, we see that, there are some specialties, of course, that would be outside of our very own functional bricks, even though we do our part, of course, in terms of change management, in terms of project deployment science, and so on and so forth. But to come back indeed to the specific question, when you talk about the core capability of procuring, you have today in your ERP certainly a main forwarding agent that is assigned, for example, for a given trade lane. But what happens, because life happens as well and issues happen all the time in those transport orders, how can you fall back actually and find an alternative should your primary option not deliver? Of course, you can tell me I am just in time, I work only with completely reliable forwarders and so on, but what you are trying to ignore or hide is the fact that these same freight forwarders are also having some failures as well in their own transportation network. The capacity is tight, the market is so fragmented, we are talking about a lot of companies that are one truck, one driver. That's a little bit the human capital of the company. So making sure as well that there is some coherence in terms of data exchange, in terms of making sure that you can reach out and have some dual sourcing as well and dual procurement as well. When it comes to transportation, for me, it's an essential angle. Another angle, and I'll try to finish off with this one, for example, is about the piece of planning itself. We mentioned indeed the visibility in transit, but let's have a very quick look into what happens in the warehouse actually. So you are blocking some teams, for example, waiting for trucks that would simply never show up. Before, you used to rely on a manual, costly, expensive process with two people that need to pick up the phone from one side and the other and coordinating on the course of action that needs to happen to mitigate that issue. Today, with the technology, not only you get the alert, but you would also get a suggestion on what is the best course of action that has to be followed in order to reduce that disruption. Should I for example, shift my truck later on the schedule? Can I rearrange, for example, my current schedule in order to make up some room and make sure that my uptime in terms of activity is always as optimum as possible? So indeed, there are 7 core capabilities. We are able to cover, I would say, in a lot of extent, at least 5 of these capabilities. I only mentioned 2, but I would love indeed to continue engaging with our audience around that one.
Thank you very much. Looking at the clock, we're running a bit out of time. There are still a few questions open from the audience. So let me just reassure that we will take this offline and we will follow up with those participants who still had some questions open. I would also like to take a second to, well, of course, thanks Thomas and Zala for the insight and to invite the audience to contact us on the emails that you can see on the screen if you will have any further questions. So if you would like to discuss a bit more in detail about Alpega TMS, there is an email address, or if you would like to talk to Thomas, you can also reach out to him directly and discuss about the partnership, discuss about the offerings and any other open question that you may have. And before we finish, of course, I would also like to invite you to our upcoming events. In the digital world today, we are continuously trying to bring up the latest topics and trends to the industry. So we will be organizing a webinar on cost reduction next month, which is it's a very relevant topic as well for the industry, for the logistics professionals. So you will receive an invitation soon to join us for this webinar. And also, I would like to invite you to check the second edition of Shippeo's event Visibility Now, that will take place both physically and online in Paris. And it will be happening on the 17th of November. So have a look and hope to see you soon. Thank you again for your time and thank you for joining us and hope to see you in October. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.